Hey everyone, it's Sevi, and welcome to my Mualani guide where we'll be covering her kit and talents, constellations, best artifact and weapon builds, team synergies, gameplay tips, and more to make the most of our goofy pro surfer. Let's begin. Mualani is a Hydro HP scaling 5-star DPS with a surfing-based gameplay that offers both amazing mobility benefits and very strong nuke damage potential. Let's check out her kit and talents. Mualani's default normal attacks have cute animations of throwing puffers, but it's not really central to her combat since its damage scales on attack. Instead, her actual gameplay comes from her skill mechanics. When you use her skill, Mualani enters her Night Soul Blessing state where she surfs on Sharky. She consumes Night Soul in order to do so, but you can use Phlogiston stamina to extend the surfing duration. You can also manually exit if you press her skill again. Riding on Sharky is amazing for exploration as it's a fast way to cover ground, water, and even liquid Phlogiston. Added actions like dodging, jumping, and continuous dashing will consume stamina faster, but surfing on water or liquid Phlogiston decreases the Night Soul consumption rate. While in this state, making contact with enemies will mark them as prey and give her a wave momentum stack up to 3 times, which you can track beside the Night Soul gauge. You can mark multiple enemies in quick succession or continuously reapply the mark on one enemy. She also gets extra resistance interruption while surfing to help prevent getting staggered while marking enemies. Then, pressing the normal attack launches the Sharky's bite attack on one target. At the same time, Mualani launches Sharky missiles towards the other marked enemies. However, the damage is reduced if more than one enemy is marked. If the enemy gets hit by the bite or missile, that removes the mark and you'll have to reapply them again. Sharky's attack also consumes the current wave stacks, and each stack grants her attack an additional HP scaling base damage multiplier. That's why you want to accumulate wave stacks to boost her damage. But more importantly, you want to get 3 stacks to turn Sharky's bite into the upgraded Surging Bite, which has 2 main benefits. First, on top of the wave stack bonuses, Surging Bite has an extra big HP base damage multiplier, allowing you to maximize her damage. And second, with her Ascension 1 passive unlocked, it generates a puffer that heads towards Mualani, but you can also approach it to obtain it faster, replenishing 20 Night Soul points. That extends her surfing time, and you can trigger this up to 2 times every Night Soul Blessing state. As such, you want to launch these upgraded Surging Bites to maximize her Night Soul Blessing time, have more time to mark enemies, and deal the most amount of damage over time. Do note that it's possible for Sharky's attacks to miss if the enemy dodges or moves out of range as Mualani is attacking. The missiles can also be blocked by objects and structures, so be wary of the situation and environment if there's a chance for those things to happen. Then Mualani's burst simply launches one instance of AoE Hydro damage that also scales on her max HP. With her A4 passive unlocked though, she gets a base damage increase depending on how many Night Soul bursts have been triggered prior to using this. Mualani's burst can get enhanced up to 3 times. To trigger the Night Soul burst mechanic, you need at least 1 Natlan party member, then dealing elemental damage from any source gives your party 1 stack of Night Soul Burst. Night Soul Burst triggers also have a cooldown time, but the more Natlan party members you have, the shorter the cooldown times for more frequent trigger intervals. But you can just treat this as a bonus, and we'll see if synergistic Natlan characters pop up in the future to help maximize this. Now that you're familiar with her abilities, another important aspect of increasing her damage is understanding her Hydro application and reaction potential. To start, while she's in her surfing state, marking enemies does not apply any Hydro on them. Rather, only Sharky's attacks and her burst will. As such, Mualani has a more controlled and slower form of Hydro application, but that works in her favor as it allows you to more easily set up reactions where her Hydro is the triggering element. One such reaction that lets her deal even more insane amounts of damage is Vaporize. Applying Hydro on a pyro-affected unit results in Vaporize, or more specifically, a Forward Vaporize reaction. Forward Vaporize amplifies the damage by adding a ×2 damage multiplier on the actual damage, basically doubling the base damage. That's obviously a huge increase, and additionally, since this is reaction damage, it gets affected by the Elemental Mastery or EM stat for even more damage. Basically, Mualani is very much suited towards a Vaporized playstyle. So Mualani's gameplay loop will consist of having teammates who can synergize to help set up the Pyro Aura on enemies. During Mualani's on-field time, you'll mark enemies and collect up to 3 wave stacks to use Sharky's Surging Bite, while the enemies are affected by Pyro to trigger big vapes. You can repeat this loop until your enemies are dead, you no longer have Night Soul or Phlogiston to consume, or when you need to reset your team rotation to set up teammate buffs and abilities. You don't have Phlogiston outside of Natlan though, so that limits your surfing time. The number of enemies you mark and possible excessive Night Soul consumption, like if you chase enemies, will affect how many bites you can do. For her exploration talent, you can restore Phlogiston while interacting with some harvestable items in Natlan, and Natlan unique resources are marked on your minimap. When leveling her talents, prioritize prioritize her skill, then burst. Don't level her normal attack talent. Even if Sharky's attacks are considered as normal attack damage, their multipliers are from her skill talent. Mualani already feels cohesive and is strong without Constellations, but for those who just want to get them, let's see what they add. C1 greatly buffs Mualani's first Surging Bite and missiles from entering her skill. Note that it's only the first instance per Night Soul Blessing state and that it's still subject to the damage decrease rule versus multiple marked enemies. And outside of combat, she consumes Night Soul and Phlogiston and slower while surfing. C2 now lets her generate wave stacks in other ways. She gets 2 simply from entering her surfing state and 1 when obtaining a puffer. Additionally, getting 2 puffers in a Night Soul Blessing state regenerates 12 Night Soul points for her. C3 increases her skill level by 3. C4 lets her generate 8 energy when picking up a puffer, thereby reducing her energy needs, and it also greatly increases her burst damage. C5 increases her burst level by 3, and finally, C6 removes the trigger limitation of her C1 buff, applying it to all her Surging Bite attacks now, which is basically going to be insanely big overall damage. Now let's go over her build, starting with artifact stats. A standard main stat build will be something like HP Sands, Hydro Damage Goblet, and a Crit Damage Circlet, but there are very viable alternatives. For one, she can also use an EM Sands, especially if she isn't getting a lot of EM buffs or substats, and that will amplify her vaporized damage. If you don't yet have a good Hydro Goblet or Crit Circlet, you can use HP main stats in the meantime, but they're generally less potent than her standard build. If she's also on an Obsidian Codex set, she already has a high starting crit rate. That's why I generally advise using a crit damage or HP circlet, then you can just get crit rate from substats. Also, I recommend having a high crit rate stat around 80 to 100%, including the Obsidian Codex buff already. Since Mualani deals damage in just a few but strong hits, you really wouldn't want those to further miss crit hits during practical combat scenarios. Then for substats, look for crit, HP, and EM. ER isn't very high priority since her burst isn't super essential to her kit, but if you want to burst every rotation, having around 120 to 140% ER can generally be enough. As always, buff sources and saturating one stat will change how effective your piece's stats are. Compare your own pieces or use an optimizer to see what works best for you. Then for her artifact sets, the new Obsidian Codex is her best in slot set. Its 2-piece effect gives a universal damage bonus when the user is on field and in their Night Soul Blessing state, but more importantly, its 4-piece effect gives a whopping 40% crit rate bonus just from consuming Night Soul while on field. That's pretty much the end goal, but while you're in the process of farming it up, less potent alternatives are the 4-piece Heart of Depth, as it gives Hydro damage and a normal attack damage bonus, or 2-piece set combos of HP, EM, Hydro damage bonus, normal attack damage bonus, and the Obsidian Codex. And for niche cases, there's the 4-piece Unfinished Reverie with a Burning Team, and the 4-piece Marechaussee Hunter if you plan to use her with Farina. Next, let's take a look at Mualani's recommended weapon options. She mainly wants weapons that can give HP, crit, and relevant damage and EM bonuses. Base attack and attack bonuses are useless for her. She has 2 very solid free-to-play weapon options. The first is the Natlan craftable Catalyst Ring of Yakshe. It has an HP substat and a normal attack damage bonus after the wearer uses their skill. The bonus depends on the user's HP, but that can easily get maxed out for her. Mappa Mara is also actually a good alternative, more so if she doesn't have a lot of EM yet. It has an EM substat and elemental damage bonus passive, both of which she'll appreciate. The limited free event weapon Ashgraven Drinking Horn will also be viable on her. However, a refined Ring of Yakshe or Mappa Mara will end up being generally better. Moving on to gacha or paid options, starting with the 4 stars. The Wit Sith has a crit damage substat with a randomized buffing mechanic among 3 types. The damage bonus and EM buffs are very powerful, especially with refinements, but the attack buff will be useless for her. So there is an element of RNG here, but when you get lucky, it's a very strong weapon on her. The Sacrificial Jade is a battle pass catalyst. The passive's HP and EM buffs are really good for her. However, if she's also using the Obsidian Codex set, you'll run into the issue of capping 100% crit rate naturally from her own stats alone, and any crit rate substats are wasted on her. So just be mindful if that's the case for you. Moving on to 5 stars, her signature weapon is Surf's Up, and it gives pretty much a lot of what she wants. A ton of crit damage, an HP bonus, and a big normal attack damage bonus that requires vaporized reactions to maintain its max stacks, which she'll easily do. For other alternatives, one is 1000 Floating Dreams, Nahida's signature weapon. Its EM and elemental damage bonuses end up being very good on Mualani's vaporized playstyle, especially if you're not using an EM Sands and or don't have much EM stat sources. The Tome of Eternal Flow is still okay for her if you have it, since even if she can't utilize the charge attack damage bonus, bonus, it's still a big crit damage and HP stat stick. And if you actually have the Everlasting Moonglow, it's a viable option thanks to its HP and normal attack bonus. However, it's not as competitive of a 5-star and can be easily matched or outperformed by even her free-to-play options. Finally, we have Mualani's team synergies. While Mualani already has viable teammates for her vaporized setups, several of them come with drawbacks and considerations. Hopefully her teammate possibilities will improve with more Natlan releases, but for now, let's go through her current options. So the first major criteria for her vaporized comp is having an off-field pyro applicator that can apply in between Mualani's attacks. Narrowing down our list comes down to 4 options for now: Xiangling, Xinyan, Dehya, and Thoma, each with their own considerations. Starting with Xiangling, it's easy to recommend her firstly since everyone will have a free copy of her, and she's generally someone you want to level up and build anyway. Her Pyronado is really fast and consistent with applying AoE pyro damage to easily set up vapes, whether on single target or AoE scenarios. And since the Pyronado follows you around, you'll conveniently apply pyro as Mualani is marking enemies. The biggest drawback is that as a solo pyro unit, she will need a lot of energy recharge to reliably burst every rotation. Using an ER weapon or energy refunding weapon is a must. 250% ER is a good general target, but that can change depending on Favonius users on your team and particle sources from enemies. Due to the stat considerations and being without Bennett, you'll have to accept that she just won't deal that much damage compared to her other teams. But compared to the other pyro options, the really big advantage she has is that her pyro application is not tied to certain trigger conditions. You just need to have enough ER, and once you use her burst, it's already just there following you and applying pyro very effectively as you mark enemies. So another option is Xinyan, who can consolidate pyro application and shielding. The main condition for her to apply pyro over time is by creating a level 3 shield, which can only be done by hitting 2 opponents with her skill or by having her at C2 then using her burst. As such, you really want to have her C2 so that she'll also work in purely single target scenarios. You'll also want enough ER to burst every rotation, but keep in mind as well that if her shield gets destroyed, then her pyro application also disappears until you refresh your rotation. You'll want a lot of defense to strengthen her shield, and since you generally don't want to dodge with Mualani to save Night Soul stamina, you'll have to really rely on her shield not breaking. There are also occasional issues in AoE scenarios where if enemies aren't grouped very closely enough or you mistimed being near them, Xinyan's periodic pyrotics might miss. As for Dehya, she also offers damage redirection and pyro application via her skill field, but her field's mechanic is not a long-term means of survivability since it only reduces and redirects a portion of damage to her while the on-field character still takes damage over time, albeit less. As such, it's best to have some other source of sustain for more comfort. Be mindful that her pyro application needs to be triggered by hitting an enemy within the skill field, so you want an off-field teammate that can deal damage over time to trigger the field. For example, putting Emily as an off-field DPS lets her consistently proc Dehya's skill field. But if an enemy spawns or goes outside the skill field, then no pyro application for them, which can happen with mobile enough enemies. And in multi-target scenarios, if enemies are positioned apart, then her pyro application may sometimes not splash to other enemies. And for Thoma, his burst attack actually triggers before Mualani can deal her hydro damage, so it's technically possible to use him as a vape setup. But in AoE scenarios, his burst attack's cone area can miss enemies that are spread apart. Also, if Mualani uses her burst at the end of the rotation, then you won't be able to vaporize it anymore since that won't trigger Thoma's burst. You may want to first stack his shield health before reaching Mualani so it won't be too fragile. Since Mualani's normal attacks aren't as frequent, she won't be restacking his burst shield as often when it's her on-field time. So basically, they all come with their own considerations. For a free and already very solid option, Xiangling is the default, so if you want to consolidate pyro application and defensive utilities, that's what the other's advantage can be. It's possible to combine 2 pyro units, but remember that the pyro resonance buff gives only attack, so it has no benefit to Mualani's damage. And of course, it's very likely we'll get other pyro units during the course of Natlan who can synergize well for Mualani. Another element that helps sustain a pyro aura is Dendro, due to Dendro and pyro triggering the burning reaction. So off-field Dendro teammates are going to be synergistic additions to the team, but some units offer more utility than just Dendro application. Nahida is really good, mainly since she gives an on-field EM bonus which Mualani will really appreciate to boost her vape reactions. Just be wary of multi-wave content where you can't reapply her skill mark unless you swap out of Mualani's surfing state. Making her a pseudo-sustain if needed is also possible by equipping the prototype Amber on her. Another is Emily, who contributes a good amount of personal damage over time, and she'll still get enhanced from the burning reaction reaction your team triggers. While she doesn't have Nahida's EM buff, she can at least compensate through her own damage. And if you don't have a sustain in the team yet, Kirara, Baizhu, and Yao Yao can assume those roles and be Dendro applicators. It's possible to have 2 Dendro teammates, which will also unlock Dendro Resonance, giving Mualani an extra EM buff. Then Animal Flex supports can slot in too. Some have Elemental Absorption and Grouping abilities, so they can absorb Pyro to help with AoE Pyro application. Grouping also helps Mualani more easily mark enemies and avoid wasting time chasing them. The 4-piece Viridescent set can shred the elemental resistance of enemies to boost your damage dealt by swirling. The tricky part is swirling Hydro so that Mualani can benefit from the resistance shred. You'll have to ensure that you can apply Hydro on an enemy first, then swirl it, so that will depend on your setup. Kazuha and Sucrose are the most notable options, especially since they give a damage bonus and EM buff respectively to boost Mualani's damage. Geo is a safe element for a 4th flex slot as well, since the crystallized reaction generally isn't as disruptive to the vape setups. Kachina and Zhongli are notable options. Kachina with a new 4-piece scroll set can give a 40% damage bonus buff to Mualani by crystallizing Hydro first, and Zhongli is a very comfy sustain option while shredding the enemy's resistance to boost team damage. One more flex possibility is running a 2nd Hydro unit. That unlocks Hydro Resonance for the HP bonus buff to benefit Mualani and any HP scaling party member. However, you have to ensure that that unit's Hydro application doesn't interfere with Mualani's vape setups. Some units can have very minimal Hydro application, so it won't be that much of a problem, while others might need more effort mitigating. I highly recommend using Xiangling since her Pyro application is the fastest compared to the others. Dendro will also be very effective at preventing or getting rid of Hydro. In some cases, an animal unit can work as well if the 2nd Hydro unit's application isn't that strong. The first really good candidate is actually Candice. She provides a normal attack damage bonus which Mualani appreciates, and if you don't have her C6, then she absolutely won't have any off-field Hydro application. So this is a case where Candice's lack of Hydro application works really well in our favor. With C6, it can still work fine with the right team setup. C6 makes her apply an instance of AoE Hydro after a character's normal attack hits, so Mualani will still apply Hydro first before her. The main issue now is that you have to make sure that you can get rid of Candice's applied Hydro before Mualani does her next attack. For example, when I used Nahida and Xiangling with a C6 Candice in a single target boss fight, Mualani's vapes were still consistently set up. However, Candice's C6 can be an issue in AoE scenarios where she'll be the first one to trigger Vaporize on enemies before the Sharky missiles can reach them and Pyro wasn't reapplied fast enough. Barbara, Yelan, Mona, and Sejwin can also be considered as relatively slower Hydro applicators in Mualani's teams, and they have their own utilities and considerations. One more Hydro option is Furina, with notable caveats though. Due to her HP drain, that limits your team to needing a healer for practical combat. For me, Baizhu was the consistent option for strong enough healing and periodic Dendro application. Furina's team-wide damage bonus benefits Mualani, and she contributes a lot of damage. Xiangling's Pyronado was the best way to reapply Pyro fast enough to counter her Hydro application. However, the Vaporize triggers can still be inconsistent. In some of my test runs versus a single target boss, I was able to vape all of Mualani's surging bites, whereas in other attempts, I got unlucky with the timing and missed Vaporizes. This issue gets exacerbated in AoE scenarios, and missing vapes on other enemies will be more noticeable. So Furina is workable, but fairly restrictive in terms of teams and combat scenarios. If you want to try such double Hydro teams, it's best to test it out with your specific comp and see how consistently you can keep up the Vaporizes in various scenarios. And if you want a team that's not Vaporize based, you could try a mono Hydro team, particularly with Furina, a healer, and preferably an animal unit to shred Hydro resistance. You no longer have to worry about reaction setups, and you'll just have to rely on the team's raw Hydro damage to power through. As always, these team discussions are not exhaustive, so you can always test things for yourself and check what others are using to see what works well for you. And that's going to be it for our guide on the lovely Mualani, so let me know in the comments if you pulled for her or are pulling for her and what you think of her so far. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!